A woman rejected for one reason, and one reason only. She could never have children. Cast aside like something broken, Lydia thought her life was over. But fate had other plans. Plans written in blood, courage, and an unexpected bond with a wounded cowboy. What if the thing that made her worthless was the very thing that led her to true love? The lesson. Sometimes what feels like your greatest flaw becomes your greatest blessing. This channel tells stories of the Wild West. Cowboys, love, family, and the compassion that defines humanity. If you enjoy meaningful stories, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The sun over Sakoro Station was a merciless hammer on a steel anvil. Elizabeth stood still on that platform, her knuckles white from gripping her only bag. The train that brought her was already chugging away, its smoke a dark stain against the bright sky, a final goodbye to all her hopes. She was utterly alone. Other folks had places to be, people to greet. Ranchers loaded up supplies. A family hugged and laughed. A man in a suit marched toward town. No one so much as glanced her way. It felt like she was invisible, which was maybe a blessing. 3 days ago she was a bride, full of a quiet hope. Her folks had passed 2 years back, and her kin made it clear there was no room for her. The one teaching job she might have gotten went to a cousin of the boss. Desperate, she answered an ad in the paper. A rancher named Samuel Hartwick wanted a wife. He sent the fare, and she made the long journey west, her heart torn between fear and a sliver of hope. They were married within hours of her arrival. The marriage was undone just as fast. "I need sons," Samuel had told her, his face as hard as a rock. "The doctor says you are barren. I paid for a wife who could provide a family." Elizabeth tried to explain that she never knew. "It does not matter," he'd said. "The deal is off." He sent her away without a second thought for where she would go. The doctor in Silver Springs, a jittery man named Peaton, at least had a flicker of a conscience. He offered her a reference for housekeeping work. But in a town owned half by Samuel Hartwick, that meant nothing. Word got around fast about the defective bride. People on the street would turn away to avoid her. She lasted 4 miserable days before spending her last bit of money on a ticket 60 miles south to Sakoro. It was a place where nobody knew her name, where she could just be Elizabeth Lizzie Carter, a woman looking for honest work, not some cast-off wife. The platform was almost empty now. A station clerk gave her a curious look before disappearing back inside his office. She had to get moving. Standing there was doing no good. Elizabeth took a deep breath of dusty air and straightened her back, just like her mother taught her. A lady always stands tall, no matter what. The main street of Sakoro was a dusty stretch of low buildings baking in the sun. She saw a bank, a saloon, and then a sign that made her heart leap just a little. Mrs. Chen's boarding house. She started walking, her boots kicking up little clouds of dust. Her bag was light. It held everything she owned in the world, a few dresses, her mother's Bible, and the letters from Samuel. She should have burned those letters, but she could not bring herself to do it. The boarding house was her first stop. She needed a room, then she needed a job. The $3.50 she had would not last long. A woman was sweeping the porch of the boarding house. She was a small Chinese lady, maybe 50, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You need a room?" she asked, her voice clear. "Yes, ma'am," Elizabeth answered. "Just for a night or two. I'm looking for work." Mrs. Chen looked her over, a long, steady gaze that was not unkind. "You running from something, or to it?" The question was so direct it startled Elizabeth. She could have lied, but something in the woman's face told her not to bother. "From something," Elizabeth said softly. but I hope to find something better." Mrs. Chen nodded. 50 cents a night. Supper is included. No men in the rooms. Pay first. Elizabeth carefully pulled out her small purse. She counted out $1 for 2 nights. That would give her 1 full day to find a job. Mrs. Chen took the coins. "Room 4, top of the stairs. Supper's at 6. Be on time." The room was small, but it was spotless. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a few hooks on the wall. After the week she had just been through, it felt like a palace. She sat on the bed and gave herself 5 minutes to feel it all. The fear, the shame, the complete and total exhaustion. Then she stood up and washed the dust from her face. She looked at the woman in the small mirror, a woman who had been told she was broken. "You are more than that," she whispered. "You are strong. You will make it through this." Her reflection did not look so sure, but it was a start. Elizabeth couldn't let doubt take hold. Sakoro's main street was bustling now. She passed the Mercantile, a sign in the window reading "Clerk Wanted." Hope fluttered as she opened the door to the chime of a bell. The place was dim, smelling of coffee and tobacco. A balding man behind the counter eyed her with suspicion. "Help you?" he grunted. When she mentioned the sign, he looked her over, cold and calculating. "You got experience?" "I am educated and excellent with figures," Elizabeth said evenly. "And I work hard." "Ain't what I asked. You worked in a store?" When she admitted she had not, he scoffed. "Can't hire a woman on her own." "Where is your husband?" The question was a slap. "I am unmarried." His lip curled. "Unmarried and alone? What kind of woman does that?" She wanted to say the kind with no other choice, but his face told her it was no use. "Thank you for your time," she said, turning before he saw her blush. "Try the saloon," he called after her. "They're always looking for girls." She kept her back straight and just kept walking. The next 2 hours were more of the same. The bank, the hotel, the restaurant all turned her away. By the time the church bells rang 5 o'clock, Elizabeth's spirit was about to break. She found herself before a quiet office. Dr. Theodore Whitmore. She wasn't sick and couldn't afford a doctor, but she needed to get off that street. Inside, it was cool and smelled of carbolic acid. A young woman at a desk looked up. "May I help you?" "Is the doctor in?" Elizabeth asked. "I was hoping to ask about employment." "Are you a nurse?" the woman asked. "No, but I can learn. I can read, write, and manage accounts." From a back room, a man's voice called out, "Maria, who is there?" "A young woman looking for a job, doctor." "Send her in." Dr. Theodore Whitmore was about 40 with keen blue eyes. He was washing his hands, his sleeves rolled up. "I'm afraid I am not hiring, Miss—" "Elizabeth Lizzie Carter," she said, meeting his gaze. "I understand, doctor, but I hope to introduce myself should things change. I am new to Sakoro and need respectable work. My father was a teacher, so I am good with numbers and organization." Suddenly, shouting erupted from the street. Horses whinnied, men yelled. "Get the doctor! He is bleeding bad!" Dr. Whitmore grabbed his bag and ran for the door. Elizabeth followed right behind him. The street was pure chaos. A huge bay horse was rearing in the road, kicking wildly. Near a hitching post lay a man, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. "That horse is going to kill someone," a man yelled. The animal was terrified, its eyes rolling. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She had grown up with horses. This one was scared, not mean. "Miss, get back!" someone shouted. But she walked steadily toward the horse, her hands open. "Easy now," she said in a low, calm voice. "No one's going to hurt you." The horse's ears twitched. It stopped its frantic dance. "That is it. Good boy." She kept talking softly, moving closer. "Your rider is hurt, but we will help him." She was close enough now that one kick could end her. She kept her calm, her hand closing around the leather reins. The horse tossed its head but stood its ground. She soothed its neck, feeling the powerful body tremble beneath her hand. "You are safe now." Behind her, Dr. Whitmore was kneeling by the injured man. Her entire focus was on the horse until its breathing slowed. She handed the reins to a wide-eyed boy. "Just walk him slow," she said. Only then did she turn. The doctor had the man's shirt open, revealing a gunshot wound in his side. "I need to get him to my office," Dr. Whitmore said. "He is losing too much blood." "I can help," Elizabeth heard herself say. The doctor looked at her. "You said you were not a nurse." "I am not, but I can follow orders and I do not faint." "Move him?" "Yes." "Then get down here." Elizabeth dropped to her knees in the dusty street, pressing her hands where Dr. Whitmore indicated, feeling hot blood pulse against her palms. The injured man's face was gray, his breathing shallow. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair and strong features currently contorted with pain. "Stay with me," Dr. Whitmore told him. "We are going to get you patched up, Miss Harper. Maintain that pressure. You men," he gestured to the gathered crowd, "I need a door to use as a stretcher." Now, the next 20 minutes passed in a blur of organized chaos. They got the wounded man, someone said his name was Cole, James Jim Walker, onto an improvised stretcher, and carried him the half-block to Dr. Whitmore's office. Elizabeth maintained pressure on the wound the entire way. Her hands slick with blood, her dress ruined, her mind oddly clear and focused. In the surgery, Dr. Whitmore worked with quick efficiency while issuing tour instructions. "Miss Harper, I need you to hand me instruments as I call for them. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Maria, prepare the chloroform. This is going to hurt like hell, and I need him unconscious." What followed was the most intense hour of Elizabeth's life. She handed scalpels and forceps and needles, held basins and sponges, mopped the doctor's brow when sweat threatened his vision. She watched him extract a bullet from between James Jim Walker's ribs, probe for damaged blood vessels, stitch torn flesh with meticulous care. "Good," Dr. Whitmore murmured at one point. "Very good, Miss Harper. Steady hands." She had not realized they were steady inside. She felt like she was trembling, but her hands remained rock solid, doing what needed to be done. Finally, Dr. Whitmore tied off the last suture and stepped back, wiping his hands. "That is all I can do. The rest is up to his constitution and luck. Maria, let's get him cleaned up and settled in the recovery room." "Miss Harper, you can." He stopped, really looking at her for the first time since the surgery had begun. She must have been quite a sight, her dress front soaked in blood, her hands stained red to the wrists, her hair falling from its pins, her face pale but composed. "You can wash up at that basin," he finished more gently. "There is soap and towels. Take your time." Elizabeth's hands began to shake the moment she plunged them into the warm water. Delayed reaction, she thought distantly, watching James Jim Walker's blood swirl pink in the basin. She scrubbed mechanically thoroughly until her skin was raw and clean. When she emerged from the surgery, Maria was brewing coffee in the outer office. Dr. Whitmore sat at his desk making notes in what looked like a patient file. He looked up as Elizabeth appeared. "Sit down before you fall down," he said, gesturing to a chair. Elizabeth sat. Maria pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands, and she sipped it gratefully despite the evening warmth. "Where did you learn to handle a panicked horse like that?" Dr. Whitmore asked. "My father kept horses. He taught me young and the steady hands during surgery. You truly have no nursing experience?" "None whatsoever. I simply did what needed doing." Dr. Whitmore studied her with those keen blue eyes. "Mr. Cole is going to need round-the-clock care for at least a week, possibly longer. The wound was serious but clean. The bullet did not nick anything vital, but infection is a real risk, and he will be in considerable pain. He lives alone on a ranch about 8 miles out. There is no one to look after him there." Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster, sensing where this was going. "Maria manages this office brilliantly, but she has family obligations that prevent her from providing overnight care," the doctor continued. "I am going to suggest that Mr. Cole convalesce here for the first few days, but after that he will need someone at the ranch. Someone who can change dressings, monitor for fever, prepare appropriate meals, ensure he does not overexert himself and tear those stitches. "You are offering me employment," Elizabeth said quietly. "I am offering you temporary employment as Mr. Cole's nurse and housekeeper, provided he agrees to the arrangement when he is conscious. Room and board included, plus wages. If you prove capable, we can discuss a more permanent position assisting me here in town." He paused. "You did good work today, Miss Harper. Exceptional work, actually. I suspect you are running from something unfortunate, and I will not pry, but if you need a chance to start fresh, I am offering one." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "I will not disappoint you. Say that you do not?" But his eyes were kind. "Now go back to wherever you are staying and get some rest. Be here at 7 tomorrow morning. We will see how our patient fares through the night." The walk back to the boarding house felt surreal. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in impossible shades of orange and purple. Elizabeth's ruined dress drew stares, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was reeling with the sheer improbability of the day. This morning she had been hopeless. Tonight she had employment. Temporary, yes, and contingent on a wounded stranger's approval, but employment nonetheless. Mrs. Chen took one look at her bloody dress and pointed wordlessly toward the back of the house. "You wash there. Burn that dress. Cannot be cleaned." At supper, a simple meal of rice, vegetables, and chicken that tasted like ambrosia to Elizabeth's empty stomach. Mrs. Chen asked no questions, but listened while the other boarders discussed the shooting. "Cole caught some rustlers on his land," said a grizzled prospector. "They objected to being caught. Lucky he made it to town," added a railroad clerk. 8 miles bleeding like that. Most men would have died. "That horse of his is loyal," the prospector continued. "And that woman who caught it, did you see that? Walked right up to a spooked animal like she was approaching a kitten." Elizabeth kept her eyes on her plate, but she felt Mrs. Chen's sharp gaze on her. Later, as she climbed the stairs to her small room, Mrs. Chen appeared beside her with a bundle of cloth. "You need better dress for nursing work," she said, pressing the bundle into Elizabeth's hands. "This belonged to my daughter. She, with husband in San Francisco, now does not need. You take." "Mrs. Chen, I can't." "You take," the older woman repeated firmly. "You did brave thing today. Brave thing and smart thing. You be good nurse for Mr. Cole. Then Dr. Whitmore keep you. Then you pay me back if you want, or you pay forward to someone else who need help. Your choice." Tears pricked at Elizabeth's eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed since Samuel Hartwick had declared her worthless. "Thank you." Mrs. Chen patted her hand once briskly, then disappeared down the hallway. In her room, Elizabeth unfolded the bundle to find a simple but serviceable work dress in dark gray cotton, plus a practical apron. She hung them carefully on the wall hooks, then sank onto her bed. The events of the day crashed over her. The despair of the morning, the rejections, the sudden violence in the street, the blood and urgency of the surgery, Dr. Whitmore's unexpected offer, and through it all, the image of the wounded man's face, James Jim Walker. She would be caring for him, living in his home, responsible for his recovery, a stranger whose life had intersected with hers in the most unlikely way. She thought of Samuel Hartwick's cruel dismissal, of Dr. Peaton's clinical verdict, of her own desperate fear that she had no value beyond the children she could not bear. Today, she had stopped a panicked horse. She had assisted in surgery. She had been offered employment based not on her womb, but on her capabilities, her steady hands, her clear head under pressure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Mr. Cole might refuse her help, might be another Samuel Hartwick who saw her only as defective goods. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Elizabeth Lizzie Carter felt a tiny flicker of something she had almost forgotten. Hope. She rose, poured fresh water in the basin, and washed again thoroughly. Then she brushed out her hair, said her evening prayers, though she kept them brief and practical, asking mainly for strength and competence rather than miracles, and climbed into the narrow bed. Through the thin window curtain she could see stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had looked down on her humiliation in Silver Springs, on her lonely train journey, on every moment of fear and shame. But also the same stars that had witnessed her courage today. Elizabeth closed her eyes and for the first time in longer than she could remember, slept without crying. Tomorrow would come, and with it whatever fate had in store for her and the wounded cowboy, whose blood still stained her memories, and whose life had become unexpectedly tangled with her own. She did not know yet that James Jim Walker would wake in 2 days, and when told of the arrangement, would agree to it with quiet gratitude. She did not know that his ranch would become a haven rather than a prison, or that his gruff silence hid a loneliness as deep as her own. Elizabeth Lizzie Carter had no idea the man she helped save valued grit more than high society. She only knew that after being cast out, her life had finally turned a corner. That night, as James Jim Walker's fever burned, Elizabeth sensed a new beginning on the horizon. The next morning, she walked into Dr. Whitmore's office to start her new job as a nurse. Maria, the doctor's wife, was already there, looking plain worn out. "How is he?" Elizabeth asked. "He's still with us," Maria answered. "The fever got bad around 10 o'clock. Mr. Cole is awake now, though, mostly just asking for water." Elizabeth set down her bundle of clean rags and a tin of healing salve. "Just tell me what needs doing." Relief seemed to wash over Maria's tired face. "Everything. For now, he needs water and broth, and cool compresses for the fever. He keeps on asking about his horse. The bay. A boy named Tommy Reese took him to the livery. The animal is safe." "Good," Maria said. "Mr. Cole is in the first room. I'll warn you, he's a bear when he's hurting." The room was small and dim. James Jim Walker lay on a cot, his chest wrapped in bandages. He looked younger than she had first thought, maybe 32 or 33. When she came close with a cup of water, his eyes opened. They were gray like a gathering storm. "You're the woman with the horse," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "I am. And you're the man who got himself shot." Elizabeth offered him the water. "Reckon you can sit up, or do you need a hand?" He tried to push himself up and turned white as a sheet. She quickly put an arm behind his shoulders. "Easy now, let me help. No need to bust open those stitches." He was stiff as a board, a man who clearly hated needing help from anyone. His eyes focused on her. "You stopped that boy. He could have shot you too." "He was just a scared kid," Elizabeth said, helping him lie back down. "Now you need to rest. I need to get to my ranch. You need to heal, Mr. Cole." But he was already drifting off, too tired to argue. Over the next 2 days, Dr. Whitmore finally announced that James would live. Though his ornery spirit might get him first, the doctor added. "He's a lone wolf, that one. So how do you feel about staying out there with a wounded, prickly stranger?" "I've faced a sight worse, Doctor." James Jim Walker was every bit as difficult as they said. He hated the bed, and he hated the broth. But he never made a sound when his dressing was changed, and he always gave a quiet thanks for the water. On the 3rd day, the doctor made his offer. "Mr. Cole, you need a nurse. I suggest Miss Harper go back to the ranch with you for 2 or 3 weeks." James's jaw tightened. "I don't need a babysitter." "That's exactly what you need," the doctor replied flatly. James turned his stormy eyes to Elizabeth. "You know how to run a ranch house?" "I know how to cook, clean, and follow a doctor's orders. For anything else, I'm a quick study." "I'm not easy company." "Neither am I at the moment," she shot back. A glimmer of respect showed in his eyes. He stared down a thunderstorm. That took grit, or maybe just foolishness. A faint smile flickered across his lips and was gone. "Fine, but this is temporary. Once I am healed, you head back to town." He made that crystal clear. "I do not need permanent help," he said. "Understood, Mr. Cole. And stay out of my business. I like my privacy." "Same here." He sized her up a moment more, making Elizabeth feel like a horse being inspected. He must have liked what he saw, because he gave a curt nod. "When are we leaving?" "Tomorrow," Dr. Whitmore said, "I will get a wagon." The ride to James Jim Walker's ranch was a long 3 hours. James leaned against the rail, his face pale with a pain he would never admit to. Elizabeth sat in the back, watching the town give way to the wide-open, lonely land. The ranch was bigger than she had pictured. The main house was solid adobe and wood, with a porch wrapping around it. A barn and corral stood behind it. The place was beautiful in its own harsh, rugged way. "I will help you inside," the doctor offered. "I can manage." But James's pride wrote a check his body could not cash. He took 2 steps before his legs gave out. Elizabeth was there in a flash, catching him under the arm. He went rigid at her touch, but was too weak to protest. Together they got him into the main bedroom. "I will sleep somewhere else," Elizabeth said quickly. "Just point me in the right direction." James waved a hand toward a nearby door. "There is a spare room. It is clean enough." The room was small but fine, with a bed, a dresser, and a window looking out at the corral. When she returned, Dr. Whitmore was giving his final orders. "Keep that wound clean. Change the dressing twice a day. If you see any red streaks or notice a bad smell, you send for me immediately. The Reese family lives about 5 miles east. Their boy Tommy can ride for help." "I understand." The doctor then turned to James. "And you listen to her. Do not try to work. Do not be a stubborn fool." "Would not dream of it," James said, his voice dry as dust. After the doctor left, a deep quiet fell over the house. Elizabeth stood in the main room, feeling the full weight of her new reality. She was alone with an injured stranger, miles from anything. His voice, rough with pain, came from the bedroom. "There is food in the larder. Coffee is in the tin by the stove." She found the kitchen was neatly organized. Coffee, flour, beans, and salt pork. Simple supplies for a man living on his own. She put on a pot of coffee and thought about what to make for supper. An hour later, she brought him a simple broth with dry toast. It was all the doctor would allow for now. He was propped up in bed, his eyes sharp despite his pale face. "This is not much of a meal," he grumbled. "It is the meal that will not make you sick." He took the broth without another word. As the sun began to set, painting the desert with fire, he asked her a sudden question. "Why are you here?" Elizabeth turned from the window. "Dr. Whitmore hired me to—" "No. Why are you in Sakoro at all? You speak like you have had an education. You do not belong out here." His words hit too close to home. "I needed a job. That is not an answer. It is the only one you're getting, Mr. Cole. You value your privacy. So do I." Their eyes locked for a long moment. An understanding seemed to pass between them. He slowly nodded and handed back the bowl. "Fair enough. Whatever you are running from, you will find no judgment here. I am not interested in a woman's past." His words were an unexpected kindness. Elizabeth took the bowl with unsteady hands. "Thank you." "Not kind," he said, "just practical. We all have our reasons." That night, Elizabeth lay awake, listening to the wind and the creaks of the old house. She heard James's restless sounds, the sharp breaths of pain he tried to hide. She rose twice to bring him water. He accepted her help with a quiet thanks each time. This was her life now, nursing a stranger in the middle of nowhere. It should have been frightening. Instead, she felt a strange sense of peace. Here, she was just a nurse doing a job, not a failure, not someone to be pitied. Just Elizabeth Lizzie Carter, hired to do honest work. And after everything she had been through, honesty felt like cool water in a dry land. The days settled into a steady rhythm. In the mornings, she tended to his wound and fixed simple meals. In the afternoons, she would read to him. She found a small collection of books on a shelf. Most were about ranching, but there was also a worn book of Shakespeare and another of poetry. "I did not take you for a poetry man," she remarked one afternoon. "It was my mother's," James said, his voice tight. "She passed when I was 12. I took the book when I left home." Elizabeth heard the finality in his tone and let it be. She read to him instead, her voice filling the quiet rooms. He listened with his eyes closed, his breathing slowly becoming even and peaceful. After a week, the doctor returned and was pleased with what he found. The wound was healing clean. Miss Harper's care has been excellent, he said. How are you managing otherwise? Fine, James said, but his eyes flickered toward Elizabeth. The single word did not tell the whole story. After the doctor left, James asked for help getting to the porch. It was his first time outside. Elizabeth saw the hunger in his eyes as he looked out over his land. "It is beautiful here," she said softly. "It is mine. That is what matters," he said, gripping the porch rail. "I bought this land 6 years ago. Every building, every fence post I earned myself. No family money, just hard work." His voice was thick with pride. He needed her to understand he was his own man. "You have built something solid," she said. He glanced at her. "You are good at this. The nursing. Have you done it before?" "No, I am learning as I go." "Could have fooled me. Doc Whitmore said I would probably be dead if it were not for you." He shifted his weight, wincing. "So, I suppose I owe you my thanks." "You do not owe me a thing, Mr. Cole. You are paying me." James. "If you are going to live in my house, call me James." "Elizabeth," she replied. He nodded, and they stood in a comfortable silence. The second week was a new challenge. James was healing too fast for his own good. Elizabeth caught him trying to haul firewood, then trying to check on his horses. He was a stubborn man. He was going to hurt himself again if she was not careful. When he tried to work in the barn, she found him pale and sweating. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" she snapped, her own fear making her voice hard. "I can't just lie here while the ranch falls to pieces. The ranch is fine. Tommy Reese is handling the animals." "A 12-year-old boy and a woman who knows nothing about this life," he growled. "This is my responsibility. And staying alive is yours." The sharp words hung between them. She understood his fear of being useless. He just stared, surprised by her fire. Then his shoulders sagged. "You're right. I don't know how to be helpless in my own home." That honest confession changed everything. "It is different for you, does not feel that way." She knew it did. She understood feeling like you were not enough. "You will get better, James, if you let yourself." Her voice carried its own hurt, and his face softened. "What happened to you, Elizabeth? What had you run in scared to Sakoro?" She could have just ignored him, but in his kitchen with the sun setting, she wanted to tell him, "I was supposed to get married. It fell through, so I came here for a fresh start. He hurt you." It was not a question. Not with his hands, but yes, he hurt me. James just nodded. Then he was a fool. Any man who would let you walk away is not worth a damn. Those simple words hit Elizabeth hard. She turned away so he could not see her eyes water. "I ought to check your bandages." He let her change the subject. That evening, Tommy Reese showed up saying rustlers were on the north pasture. James tried to grab the rifle off the wall, but Elizabeth stood right in his way. "Tommy can handle it," she said. Or he can fetch the sheriff. You are not about to ride out there and get yourself killed. Those are my cattle. They are my cows, and you are risking your neck, Tommy. You ride to town and get the sheriff. Tell him what you saw." The boy looked between the two of them, then ran for his horse. James stood there, mad and restless, while Elizabeth held her ground. "You cannot do everything by yourself," she told him quietly. "Sometimes you have to let folks help. I do not trust Easy, neither do I. But we do not have much of a choice, do we?" The sheriff came and handled the rustlers. James took the news with a grim look, admitting Elizabeth was right to stop him. "You are a stubborn woman," he said at supper. "So I hear. Good. You have to be stubborn out here. Weak folks do not make it." Elizabeth thought about her own body's weakness, but she did not say a word. Later, she wondered if his idea of weakness was different than hers. He valued grit and the will to keep going. None of that had to do with having babies. It was a strange thought. At the start of the third week, Dr. Whitmore said James could start light work. The stitches could come out soon. The danger was past. His healing was going better than planned, thanks to Miss Harper's good care. "You have a gift for this," the doctor later said with a smile. "Have you thought about training to be a nurse?" "No," Elizabeth said, a little too fast. She was good at this work, but the idea of staying in Sakoro, where her past might find her, made her chest feel tight. After the doctor left, James, the wounded man, asked, You planning to leave once I am healed? That was the agreement. I am asking what you want. Elizabeth started cleaning up. I have not thought that far ahead. Liar, he said softly. She turned to see him watching her. You are always thinking ahead. You plan everything. So, what is it you want, Elizabeth? The question was huge. She wanted safety. She wanted a place where her past did not define her. I want to not be afraid anymore, she said, the honest words hanging in the air. Being scared out here makes a whole lot of sense. This land ain't forgiving, but there's a line between cautious and plain spooked. She watched James get back on his feet, moving around the ranch with a quiet strength that was just part of him. He was a man who seemed complete on his own, and that was something to admire. One evening, watching the sun dip low, he spoke up without looking at her. You could stay. Her heart skipped a beat. The ranch could use a proper hand with the house, he said, all business. I'd pay you fair. The space would be yours. It was a job offer, plain and simple. But she heard what was underneath it. The quiet house wasn't quite so empty with her in it. And maybe, just maybe, he was getting used to the company. Think on it, she said, not trusting her voice. That night she could not sleep. Staying meant she would be safe. It was a job, a place to start over. But it also meant being near this man she was starting to respect. And respect could turn into something else, something that would break her heart when he found out she could not have children. It was better to leave before he learned the truth, before she let herself hope. But when the sun came up, Elizabeth still did not know what to do. She was caught between the fear that brought her to Sakoro and the small chance of a new life. In the main room, she could hear James starting the coffee. He was a man who liked being alone, but he had offered her a place in his world. Was she brave enough to take it? Elizabeth's answer was not in words. She just stayed. She stayed a 4th week, then a 5th. She fell into the rhythm of ranch life like she was born to it. She planted a garden, mended his shirts, and fixed his messy books into neat ledgers that tracked every dollar. She learned to bake in his tricky oven and how to read the sky for rain, just like James. And bit by bit, they learned about each other. James did not talk much, but his actions were steady. He worked from sunup to sundown. He never yelled, but could shut you down with a single look. He was fair in his dealings, and once rode 10 miles to return a borrowed tool. Elizabeth also found out he had a dry sense of humor. When she burned her first batch of biscuits, he looked at one and said, "Well, if we run out of bullets, we got these." When a hen would not leave her nest, he looked at Elizabeth and said, "She reminds me of somebody. Cannot think who." These little moments were treasures in the quiet of the ranch. But there was also tension. James was not used to sharing his house. Elizabeth was always worried about crossing a line, about forgetting this was just a job, not a home. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was a late September evening. They'd taken to having coffee on the porch after supper, just sitting in the quiet. James was quieter than usual that night. "Something weighing on you?" Elizabeth finally asked. He took his time answering. "Doc Whitmore told me you turned down his offer, said you could train to be a nurse." Her stomach clenched up. "Are you telling me it's time to leave?" "I'm asking why you haven't," he said, his eyes hard to read in the dusk. "You've been here 2 months, Elizabeth. The job's done. Why stay here on this ranch instead of in town?" The question just hung there in the cool air. She knew the simple truth wasn't going to cut it anymore. "If you're going to stay, and I want you to stay," he said gently, "I need to know what I'm dealing with." "Is somebody coming after you?" "No, nothing like that." She took a shaky breath. "I'm running from shame, from a judgment I can't shake." "What judgment?" And there it was. The moment she'd been dreading. "I was a mail-order bride," she said, the words tasting like ash. "I came to Silver Springs to marry a rancher, Samuel Hartwick. We were married, and he had it annulled the very next day. James just waited, his face a stone mask. He had a doctor check me. The doctor said I'm barren. I can't have children. She forced the words out. Samuel wanted sons. When he found out I couldn't give him any, he sent me away like damaged goods. The whole town knew. I was a joke, a woman who couldn't even do the one thing she was made for. The silence that followed felt like a lifetime. She couldn't look at him, just waited for him to tell her to leave. And you thought I'd care about that? The question caught her by surprise. She looked up and saw he was genuinely confused. Every man cares, she said, bitterness creeping in. That's why men get married. Less valuable? Less worthy of respect? His voice went hard as iron. That is the most foolish thing I've ever heard in my life. Samuel Hartwick is a fool. James stood up, pacing the porch. You think your worth is tied to whether or not you can have a baby? You think that's all you are? It's what men believe. Then most men are idiots, he shot back. You've proven you're smart, capable, and braver than half the men I know. You saved my hide. You helped with that surgery. You've made this place better. And you think none of that matters? It didn't matter to him. Then he's a damn fool who deserves to be alone. Listen to me, Elizabeth, James said, sitting back down. I don't want children. Never have. The thought of it scares me more than any drought or wildfire. I chose this solitary life for a reason. Elizabeth just stared, trying to make sense of his words. I want you to stay, because you make this ranch run better, he went on. I want you to stay because I respect you, and because your company is good. None of that has a single thing to do with having babies. You say that now, but nothing. It's the truth, he said, his gaze steady. I'm not Samuel Hartwick. I don't see you that way. Then what do you want? She whispered. He was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I'm still figuring that part out. I know I want you to stay. I know your being here means more to me than I ever thought it would. Beyond that, he shrugged. I've spent a long time avoiding feelings. Me too, Elizabeth admitted. Love always seemed like something for other people. She looked at him. You're not what I expected, James Jim Walker. A small smile touched his lips. Fair enough. But know this. Your secret is safe here. It doesn't change a thing. You're still Elizabeth to me. The same stubborn woman who fusses at me and burns the biscuits. Despite herself, Elizabeth laughed. I do not. You absolutely do, he teased. Last week you read that poem so serious I thought you were confessing to a murder. It practically is one. As they sat there in the dark, something tight and painful inside Elizabeth finally started to unwind. He knew the worst of it, the thing that made her feel worthless, and he didn't care. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For not being Samuel Hartwick. That's a low bar, he said. But I'll take it. The air between them had changed. The careful distance was gone, replaced by a comfortable ease. Elizabeth was just beginning to think she could build a life here. After the shame and the judgment, James Jim Walker's quiet ranch felt like a safe harbor. But hope is a fragile thing out in the desert. The shattering of that hope arrived in a fancy buggy, kicking up dust. A woman stepped out, maybe 40, dressed in expensive city clothes that had no place on a ranch. She swept onto the porch, and her eyes raked over Elizabeth's work dress with pure disdain. She was Catherine Blackwood, the widow of James's old boss. When James came out from the barn, a weary look settled on his face. He introduced Elizabeth as the woman who managed his household. Catherine just smiled, calling her the help. That smile of Catherine's could cut glass. I had no idea you'd hired domestic staff, James, she said. I have a proposal for you. One I would rather discuss in private. Elizabeth knew a dismissal when she heard one. She retreated to the kitchen, but the thin walls of the ranch house told her everything. Catherine spoke of her late husband's high regard for James. She said she had inherited 3 ranches and more cattle than she could manage. "I am not offering you a job, James," Catherine said coolly. "I am offering you a partnership. Full control of all my Colorado holdings for a 50% share of the profits." Elizabeth's hands froze in her bread dough. It was an offer of a kingdom. He asked, his voice steady. "Your skill, your good name," and he paused, "your family name." "I am proposing marriage, James. A partnership in business and in life. We are practical people who understand one another. We have respect, which is more than most folks can say. Together, we could build something that lasts." The quiet stretched out until Elizabeth felt her own heart stop. "I appreciate the offer," James finally said, "but I will need some time. Of course, I will be at the hotel in Sakoro for the week. Find me when you have your answer." She stood up. "Think hard, James. This is a nice ranch, but it is small. What I am offering is a chance at a legacy, a real partner who knows this business, not just someone who, well, you know what I mean." When Catherine was gone, the house went dead silent. Elizabeth stood at the table, her hands deep in dough, her head spinning. A partnership, marriage, everything James claimed he never wanted, offered in a way he might just take. And Catherine Blackwood was everything she was not. His steps sounded on the porch before the door creaked open. She could not make herself look at him. "Elizabeth, you ought to take her offer." The words were flat and empty. "It is a fine opportunity, better than anything you can build here by yourself. I did not ask for your thoughts on my business. No, but I am giving them." She finally met his eyes, her face a careful mask. "Mrs. Blackwood is right. This ranch is small. She is offering you a future. A practical marriage to a woman who gets your work makes a lot more sense." James crossed his arms, his face a stone wall. "More sense than what? Say it, Elizabeth. Than keeping a housekeeper and living all alone out here. She can give you a partnership and a real future. I can give you clean shirts and dinner on the table. Is that what you truly think?" His voice went low and dangerous. "That all you are is hired help. It is all I can be." The hurt was rising, about to spill over. "She is the right choice for you, James. She is what a man like you deserves. A man like me." He stepped closer, his gray eyes burning. "And what kind of man is that? Someone with ambition, someone who deserves a real partner, not some broken woman who cannot even—" She stopped, choking on the words. "There it is." James's voice was hard as iron. "You are still letting Samuel Hartwick and that doctor of his decide what you are worth, still believing you are less because of something you cannot control. It is not belief. It is the truth. Catherine Blackwood can give you sons to carry on your name. I cannot. She can give you connections, opportunities. I am just your housekeeper. You are not just anything." He was right in front of her now, his hands gripping the table. "And I told you before, I do not want children. I could not care less about connections or a fancy name. What I want." He cut himself off like the words had escaped him. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you want, James?" The question hung in the air, heavy with everything they had not said. His jaw was tight, his eyes searching her face. "I want you to stop running," he said, his voice rough. "I want you to stop thinking you are worth less than you are. I want you to look at what we have built here these past 2 months and see it for what it is. And what is that? It is a partnership, Elizabeth. Maybe not Catherine's kind, but it is real. We work well together. You have made this place better. You have made my life better. And it has nothing to do with children or status or any of that nonsense." "But you could have so much more with her," Elizabeth whispered. "So much more. More money, maybe. More land," his voice softened. "But not more peace, not more honest company. Not more of what really matters to me." Elizabeth fought back the tears that were welling up. "You are not thinking straight." Catherine surprised you with that offer. You need time to consider it, without this complicating things. This? James's laugh was brittle. You really do not see it? Or are you just too afraid to say it? Say what? He pushed away from the table, raking a hand through his hair. That this stopped being a job weeks ago. That when I said I wanted you to stay, it was not for your housekeeping. That every time you fuss at me or read on the porch or laugh, I think about how empty this house was before you came, and how empty it would be if you left. His words hit her like stones, cracking the walls she had built around her heart. James, do not tell the truth. Why not? You wanted honesty from me, and now you have it. He looked right at her. I care about you, Elizabeth, more than I ever planned to. And the thought of marrying Catherine Blackwood for business while you are here as my housekeeper just turns my stomach. Then send me away, her voice cracked. Take her offer and send me away. It is the practical thing to do. The hell it is. James, be sensible. I am Barren. I cannot give you a family. I do not have a family line worth a damn. The words came out like a shot. He rarely raised his voice, and it shocked them both. He took a long breath. I left home at 17 and never looked back. My father was a mean drunk. My brothers were just like him. I have no interest in passing along that name or that blood. The notion that I would need children is built on nothing that has to do with me. Elizabeth just stared, this truth changing everything she thought she knew. So when I say I do not care that you are barren, I mean it, James said, quieter now. It is not something I am ignoring. It is irrelevant to me. What matters is that you are smart and brave and stubborn. What matters is that I respect you more than anyone I have known in years. What matters is that I want to build my life with you. Not in spite of what you think is a flaw, but because of the woman you are. The tears were falling freely now. You do not know what you are saying. You're just caught up in the moment. I know exactly what I am saying. He stepped closer, his voice gentle. I am saying that children were never the reason I would want you. I am saying Catherine's offer means nothing to me because it would mean losing you. I'm saying that if you could stop believing what Samuel Hartwick told you, you would see we already have something worth fighting for. What if you change your mind? The question was small and full of fear. What if one day you regret choosing me? What if I do not? What if this, he motioned between them, is everything I need? What if you are everything I need? Elizabeth wanted so badly to believe him. But years of being told her worth was tied to having children made it almost impossible to accept. I need to think, she finally said. This is too much, too fast. I know. James stepped back to give her room. Take all the time you need. I am riding out to check the north pasture. I will be gone for most of the day. After he left, Elizabeth fell into a chair and cried. It was not from sadness, but from the shock of having her whole world turned upside down. James cared for her. He had basically turned down Catherine Blackwood because he wanted a future with his housekeeper. A barren woman with a broken past. It made no sense at all, except it made a terrible kind of sense if he truly meant everything he said. All day, Elizabeth felt like a ghost in the house. Catherine's offer echoed in her mind, sounding just like the doctor's verdict that had branded her worthless. She compared Catherine's confident wealth to James's quiet strength. He had never once made her feel small. He had listened to her, argued with her about poetry, and shared his morning coffee in comfortable silence. He had told her, "You are exactly who I need." As the sun bled across the horizon, Elizabeth sat on the porch. She had come to love this harsh, honest land, and she had to admit she had come to love the man who called it home. When James rode in from the range, she was waiting. "I have been thinking," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am trying to be brave enough to believe you meant what you said." James climbed the steps and looked her square in the eye. "I meant every last word of it, Elizabeth." A knot in her chest loosened. Then I have to ask, she said. When you talk about building a life, are you offering me a job, or are you offering something more? His answer was quiet but solid as an old oak. I am offering something more. A real partnership. Not some business deal, but something built on respect. I am offering a future, facing this land together. He paused. I reckon I am offering my heart, clumsy as I am with it. I am likely to make a mess of it too, she whispered. Then we will learn together, he said, holding out his hand. So, Elizabeth Lizzie Carter, will you take a chance on a quiet man who means what he says? His rough hand was steady. This was it. The familiar pain or the terrifying hope she was enough. Elizabeth put her hand in his. Yes. James's fingers closed around hers, pulling her close. They just stood there in the fading light. He brushed a tear from her cheek. You cry a lot around me. These are different tears. I am still deciding if they are good or bad. His smile finally reached his eyes. Take your time. I am not going anywhere. Neither am I, she said, and felt it in her bones. She was done running. As darkness fell, he finally spoke. I should ride to Sakoro and tell Catherine my decision. He shook his head when she offered to come. I had best handle this myself. She deserves that much. She will not be happy. No, but Catherine is a practical woman. He squeezed Elizabeth's hand. Will you be all right? I have been alone most of my life. But when he left, the ranch felt terribly empty. She scrubbed clean floors and kneaded bread dough too hard just to keep the doubts away. What if he changed his mind? By the time she heard his horse, she was worn out with worry. She met him at the barn. It is done, he said, swinging down from the saddle. Catherine took it. Better than I figured. She called me a fool, but wished me well. Did you tell her about me? I told her I found what I needed right here. He started unsaddling his horse. She is a smart woman, she understood. Elizabeth helped him, the familiar work calming her down. Any regrets about turning down a fortune for a stubborn woman who burns biscuits? Ask me in 20 years. That is no answer. It is the only one I have. He turned to her. I cannot promise I will not wonder, but I can promise this is what I want. You are what I want. His honest words melted her fear. Then I suppose we should talk about what is next. They talked late into the night, not about romance, but about how a partnership would work. Marriage seems the logical step, James said. It is practical and will stop any gossip. Elizabeth had to smile. You are proposing? This is the least romantic proposal ever. I am not a romantic man, I know. But a little bit would not hurt you. He looked serious. You want me on one knee with some poetry? No, I prefer you honest and plain. She put her hand over his. Yes, James, I will marry you. Good. His eyes were warm. We will do it right. We will invite Doc Whitmore and anyone you want. I would like Mrs. Chen and Maria. Then they are invited. 3 weeks later, they married in the doctor's parlor with a few friends watching. Elizabeth wore a simple blue dress Mrs. Chen had helped her make. James had even combed his hair. They spoke the old words with quiet meaning and sealed it with a short, simple kiss that filled Elizabeth with warmth. Well, said Dr. Whitmore, that is the most sensible wedding I have ever seen. Mrs. Chen gave Elizabeth a package. For your new life. It held beautiful bed linens. You cry at happy things now, the older woman said. That is a good change. Back at the ranch, being husband and wife felt right. This was a true partnership. The first months were a time of learning. James had been alone for so many years, he was not used to sharing his life or his troubles. Being together for every meal and quiet moment was a comfort, but sometimes it felt a mite crowded. Elizabeth knew he needed his space. Some afternoons, she'd see him saddle up Thunder and just say, "Supper will be warm when you get back." He could ride out alone, no questions asked. She'd take to her own room some nights, too, so they could both breathe. This is a little different, James said one night. Most wives wouldn't like separate rooms. Well, I ain't most wives, Elizabeth said, pouring coffee. And you ain't most husbands. We're finding our own way. He thought on that for a bit. No, I like that you have your own place, that you're choosing to be here. Then I don't mind either, she said, sitting across from him, though I might change my mind later on. Fair enough, he agreed. They fell into a rhythm. Mornings were for chores, him with the stock and her with the house and garden. Afternoons, they'd often work together. Evenings were for talking or just sitting in a comfortable quiet. And little by little, the separate rooms didn't seem so separate. Sometimes Elizabeth would doze off in the main room and James would carry her to bed. One freezing night, he joined her when the fire died down. The separate rooms became more of an idea than a fact, a sign they were their own people, even married. Winter came on hard. A bad storm took some cattle and tore up the barn roof. Then Elizabeth got a fever, and James tore through a blizzard to get the doctor, more reckless for her than he'd ever been for himself. The doctor said it was just the flu, but James still hovered over her. "You're being silly," she told him, her voice weak. "You were talking out of your head yesterday," he said. "What did I say?" "You kept saying you were sorry. To Samuel Hartwick, your folks, to me. Said you were sorry for being broken, and not enough." His jaw was set tight. "Even sick, you carry that shame." Elizabeth looked away. "Old wounds mend slow." "Maybe," he said, sitting on the bed. "But you need to hear this and remember it. You are not broken. You are not worthless. And you are more than enough." "You sound like a preacher." "I sound like a man who's scared to lose his wife," he said, his voice raw. "I need you to know your own value." "I'm not going anywhere, James. It's just a fever." "This time," he said. "But I need to know you believe you're worth fighting for." She took his hand. "I'll fight. I promise." Spring brought new life and new trouble. Word got around Sakoro about James marrying his housekeeper. Some thought it was romantic, others a scandal. It was just talk until Martha Henderson decided to make Elizabeth her personal charity case. "You poor thing," Martha said to Elizabeth at the store. "To be rejected like that, and then to have to settle." "I'm not settling for anything, Mrs. Henderson. I am very happy." "Of course you are, dear. So brave of you." "Why, if I couldn't have children, I suppose I'd just have to find some other useful purpose." "How lucky for you that you don't have to," Elizabeth said with a tight smile. But the words stung. She thought she'd left all that judgment behind her. On the ride home, she was so quiet, James knew something was wrong. She told him about Martha. "I know it shouldn't get to me, but it does." "Martha Henderson's got a mean streak and a small mind," James said, his voice like flint. "Her opinion is worth nothing." "It matters if that's what everyone thinks." "Then everyone is a fool," he said, stopping the wagon. "Look at me, Elizabeth. Do I look at you with pity? Do I act like you settled?" "No." "Then why does her opinion count more than mine?" "It doesn't, but it's not just her. The whole town can go hang. We live for us, for what we're building right here." He held her face in his hands. "I chose you, Elizabeth, because you're the strongest woman I've ever known. You make this lonely place feel like a home. That is the God's honest truth. The rest is just noise." She leaned into his hands, feeling stronger. "I love you. I don't believe I've said that right out." "You haven't," he said, his thumb brushing her cheek. "But I knew." "How?" "Because you stayed. Because you argue with me. Because you read bad poems with all your heart and burned biscuits with grit." He gave a small smile. "I love you too, in case you couldn't tell. You're not one for fancy words. I'll work on it then." And they did. They learned to speak what was in their hearts, building a trust that was all their own. Summer brought a new kind of test. The Ree family was moving away, and their boy Tommy was broken up about leaving his horse. He asked if we might buy the mare, James told Elizabeth over supper. Did you say yes? I told him I'd think on it. He put his cup down. But I'm thinking bigger. The Ree Ranch borders ours to the east. If we bought it, we could run more cattle. It's a risk. It means more debt and hard work. Elizabeth watched him close. This ain't about Catherine Blackwood, is it? No. This is about seeing a chance and having a partner I trust to see it through. He reached for her hand. I wouldn't even think of it if I was alone. But with you running the books and the business end, we could do this. We could build something real, together. Together, Elizabeth said. Equal partners. Equal partners, he confirmed. We do this together, or not at all. We make it or break it, side by side. This was it. This was the partnership she'd always wanted. One built on respect and love, not just duty. It valued her mind and her spirit. Yes, she said. Let's do it. Let's buy the Ree Ranch. They bought it by August, and life became a whirlwind of work. They hired on 2 ranch hands. They hired 2 brothers from downstate, good men with cattle. Elizabeth organized the growing ranch like she ran the house. They also kept their promise to Tommy, buying his horse and letting him visit. We are building something here, she told James one evening. He looked up from his papers. Does it feel like it is enough? She knew he was asking if she regretted not having children. Sometimes I wonder, she said honestly. But I feel full. This life, our work, it is enough. He nodded. Stranger things have happened. A man who never wanted to share his life is now grateful for you every day. That was almost romantic, James Jim Walker. Do not get used to it. You are getting better, though. 1 year later, Elizabeth's life had changed completely. The woman who had stood shamed and alone was now the co-owner of a thriving ranch. She was a wife to a good man who valued her mind and her grit. On their anniversary, James gave her a leather-bound ledger. Inside, he had written, "The Partnership of James and Elizabeth Cole, established October 15th, 1885. Elizabeth smiled. It is a business contract disguised as a romantic gesture. It is an acknowledgement, he said, that your contributions here are equal to mine, equal partners in all things. Equal partners, he confirmed, in business, in life, in everything that truly matters. That evening they rode to the highest point on their land. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of orange and purple. I used to think I was like damaged goods, Elizabeth said softly. Returned because I was told I had no value. You were never damaged, Elizabeth, James said, his arm around her. You were just misunderstood by folks too small to see your real worth. I saw it the first day you walked up to a spooked horse without a bit of fear. She leaned against him, a feeling of peace settling deep in her bones. You know I love you, she teased. I do know, he said with a grin. But I like to hear it anyway. They sat in the quiet dark, 2 people who had found exactly what they needed, even if it was not what the world said they should want. He never cared for heirs, just an honest partner to build a life with on this tough land. Elizabeth needed a man who saw her for who she was, not what society demanded. He proved with his actions that she was always enough. In the quiet of the evening, she finally felt free from the shame her first husband had forced on her. She was Elizabeth Cole, a rancher, a beloved wife. She was whole. The years that followed were a mix of good and bad. Their herd swelled from 50 head to near 200, and they hired more hands to help. Elizabeth managed it all with a quiet strength. But success gets you noticed. One spring day, Samuel Hartwick, her first husband, rolled up in a fancy buggy. Elizabeth was planting beans, and a chill ran right through her, despite the Texas sun. James saw him coming from the pasture. That's Samuel Hartwick, she said, her voice steady. My first husband. James's face went hard as iron. Want me to run him off? He asked. No, she said, standing tall. I want him to see me now. Samuel looked surprised to see her. He had not aged well. "Elizabeth," he started, "or is it something else these days?" "Elizabeth Cole, this is my husband James." She stood right beside James, who was a solid wall of protection. "What brings you here, Mr. Hartwick?" he asked. "Business. I hear the Cole Ranch might sell some grazing rights." His eyes scanned their land like a vulture. "Then you wasted a trip," James said, his voice flat. "We are not selling. Not to you." Samuel's lips got thin. "You might change your mind. I am paying well above market for water access." "No amount of money," James said, "would make me deal with a man who treated my wife like you did. I treated her as we agreed. She failed to be a proper wife." Elizabeth spoke before James could. "I was a good wife in every way that mattered. The only thing I could not give you was a child, and you decided that was all I was good for." "Children are what marriage is for," he sneered. "My marriage to James is proof that you are wrong," she replied. Samuel let out an ugly laugh. "You call this thriving? Living out here, working like a field hand?" "Yes, I do," Elizabeth said, her voice clear and strong. "It is thriving compared to being treated like livestock. My husband and I own this ranch together. I am his partner. I am valued for my mind, not just my body. So yes, Mr. Hartwick, I am thriving." James's hand found hers. Samuel's face turned beet red. "You always were too stubborn for your own good," he spat. "It is a good thing I found a man who sees me as his equal," Elizabeth said calmly. "Our business is done. Please leave." Samuel looked from her to James's cold stare and climbed back into his buggy. "You will regret this," he yelled as he rode off. They watched him disappear. Only then did Elizabeth let herself shake. James pulled her close. "You were amazing," he whispered. "I was scared to death. Could not tell. You stood up to him like a queen." "He could not think he broke me," she said, looking up at him. "Did you mean it? About me being your equal?" "I have meant it from day one," he said, holding her face in his hands. "You are my partner in everything. Never, ever doubt that." Facing Samuel freed Elizabeth from the last of her old fears. She had proved to herself that his judgment meant nothing. In fact, he had accidentally sent her toward a much better life. That summer, another visitor came, but this one was welcome. Dr. Whitmore arrived with a young pregnant woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had that same haunted look Elizabeth once wore. "Sarah is in a tight spot," the doctor explained. "I hoped you folks might be able to help." Her man left when she got pregnant, and her family turned their backs. With a baby due in 3 months, she was broke and alone. Sarah's voice was a whisper. "I have no money." Elizabeth cut in kindly. "But you need a place, and we need help. With this ranch growing, I can't handle the house and the books. If you can cook and clean, we can offer a room, food, and pay. We will figure things out after the baby arrives." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "You'd take me in, knowing everything?" Elizabeth's voice was firm. "Especially knowing. You are not the first woman left holding a man's broken promises. You deserve better than to be cast out for his mistake." James, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "The little cabin by the creek is empty. It is sturdy. We could fix it up for you and the baby. Give you your own space." "Why would you do this for me?" Sarah asked. Elizabeth and James shared a look before she answered. "Because someone did the same for me when I was at the end of my rope." 2 weeks later, Sarah moved into the cabin. The worry slowly started to fade from her eyes. She was a fine cook and kept the main house spotless. More than that, she started to smile again. When her time came one September night, Elizabeth sat with her, holding her hand while Dr. Whitmore handled the rest. Her daughter was born right as the sun came up, a healthy little baby with her mother's dark eyes. "She is perfect," Sarah whispered, clutching her child. "Yes, she is," Elizabeth agreed, feeling a mix of happiness and a familiar ache. She would never hold her own baby that way. But seeing the love on Sarah's face, She felt a genuine joy that pushed past her own sorrow. Later, James asked her, "Are you okay? That had to be tough." "It was hard, but it was beautiful," she said, leaning on him. "I will not lie, it hurt a little, but mostly, I just felt honored to help bring that child into the world. Does that make any sense?" "Perfect sense," he said, kissing her forehead. "You're going to be like an aunt to that little girl." Sarah did not leave. She and her daughter, Emma, stayed, becoming more than just hired help. They were family, the kind you choose. Emma learned to walk in their kitchen and called them Aunt Elizabeth and Uncle James. When Sarah eventually married a quiet ranch hand, a good man who loved them both, Elizabeth and James stood beside them at the wedding on the ranch. "We are building something special here," Elizabeth told James that night. "A refuge for folks who have been judged and cast aside," James agreed. It made sense considering how they both started. Word got around that the Coles were fair people, and soon the ranch attracted workers who needed a second chance. Everyone who came found a place at the ranch and helped it thrive. But that kind of success always draws flies. In their 5th year, Martha Henderson started her so-called charitable society, which was mostly just a way to pass judgment on her neighbors. The society's first order of business was a visit to the Cole Ranch to inspect their moral character. Elizabeth met Martha and 4 other women right there on the porch, and she sure did not ask them in for coffee. "Mrs. Cole," Martha began with a fake smile, "we have some concerns about your household." "Is that right?" Elizabeth's voice was even. "We have heard you keep an unwed mother and her illegitimate child here. That sets a poor example for the community." "Sarah Mitchell works as our housekeeper. Her job is based on her hard work, not who she married. But you must see how it looks. A woman like that raising a child of sin." "Stop!" Elizabeth's voice cut through the air. "You will not use that kind of talk about Sarah or her little girl on my land. Sarah was the one who was wronged. The real shame belongs to the man who left her." "We are just worried about the influence," Martha insisted. "There are standards to uphold." "Standards? Like saying a woman is worthless if she cannot bear children? Like judging people for not fitting in a neat little box?" "I know all about those standards, Mrs. Henderson. They are the same ones used to cast me aside 3 years ago." The women looked at each other, uncomfortable. "You all know my story," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "You know my first husband sent me away like damaged property because I am barren. You know I came here with nothing, but I built a life with a man who values me for who I am." "That is different," Martha said weakly. "You are respectable now." "I'm the same woman I was 3 years back. The only thing that changed is I found someone who looked past the judgment. Sarah deserves that same chance. So does every person here who has been rejected. This ranch is a place where people are judged by their character, not by your rules. If our way of life troubles you, I suggest you leave. We have work to do, and we do not need your approval." Martha straightened up. "The whole town will hear of this." "The town can think what it wants," Elizabeth said. "Good day, ladies." She turned and shut the door behind her. Her hands were shaking, but she meant every word. James found her a moment later. "I heard shouting. Figured I would stay out of your way unless you needed me." "I handled it." "I saw that. I also saw you just declared war on every busybody in Sakoro." Elizabeth gave a shaky laugh. "I suppose I did. Does that worry you?" "Not one bit. I am just proud of you, Elizabeth. That took real grit. Or I'm just a fool. Martha's not going to let this go." And they did. They stood against the whispers and judgment of the town. Their ranch became known as a place for a second chance. Elizabeth learned that society's opinion could not touch her anymore. She had her husband, her home, and the family they had chosen to build around them. That was more than enough. The years passed, marked by the rhythm of ranch life. They faced droughts, sickness, and rustlers. Through it all, Elizabeth and James stood together, their love and respect growing stronger with every storm they weathered. It was on their 10th anniversary that James gave her a gift, that brought tears to her eyes. He took her to their favorite spot on the ridge, overlooking everything they had built. They told Elizabeth Cole she was worthless, sent her back like she was broken goods, all because she could not have children. She got to town with just $3 and a whole lot of shame. But a quiet rancher, James, saw something different in her. He saw a partner. For 10 years, they worked side by side, building something from the ground up. Then one evening, he pulled out a deed. He had gone and made it official, putting her name right next to his. The Cole Partnership Ranch. He said half of it was hers by right, not just by marriage. That is when she knew she was truly home. Looking out from their porch, they could see the whole life they had made. There was smoke rising from Sarah's cabin, a young woman they had given a new start. The bunkhouse was full of 6 good ranch hands who had found their dignity again. "Do you ever regret it?" Elizabeth asked softly. "Not for a single second," James told her, pulling her in close. "Legacy is not just about the children you have. It is about the people you help. That is what really lasts." And they kept right on building. They bought another piece of land and even started a small school for all the children in the area. When the Panic of 1893 hit hard, they made sure their workers were taken care of. That kind of investment in people paid back more than money ever could. Their whole marriage was built on that same solid ground of respect and honesty. For their 20th anniversary, they threw a big celebration for everyone who had been part of their journey. James stood up and raised his glass. 20 years ago, I was a man who thought he was fine on his own. I was wrong. My wife took a chance on me, and she made my whole life better." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "And I am grateful he was a man who saw past what society thought, to the person I really was. We built a real home here." In that moment, watching her friends cheer, the broken woman who had stepped off that train felt completely whole. Later on, sitting on the porch, he asked her, "Any regrets?" Elizabeth thought on it. "I regret the pain I went through, but I cannot regret the road that brought me here. This life we have is better than I ever could have imagined." She added, "I get sad sometimes thinking about children, but it is not regret. Our family is just different, and it is more than enough." "Good," he said quietly, "because you have always been more than enough for me. Children were never why I wanted you. Never." And that was the honest truth of it. Elizabeth Cole had been called broken, but she refused to believe it. She found a good man who saw her true value. Together they built a life and a safe place for other folks who had been cast aside. They proved family is something you can choose, and a legacy is about the good you build in the world. She had been told she was not enough, but sitting there beside her husband, she knew she had found everything that ever really mattered.